Well remembered, thank you. Yeah, apologies to Lydia, we missed a few minutes there, sorry. We're talking about a succession, and we're talking also about how in gardening and growing and farming, we were a bit obsessed with annual plants. And what this diagram is telling us is that annual plants are very rare. They're not what's common in nature. Nature is full of perennials. All of the rest of this transition, of this succession transition, is perennial plants. So, and to grow annuals, we need to go right back to bare soil. So to do farming, we need to remove the long-term overstory canopy plants, get rid of all of this ecosystem and go right back to bare soil, and then we can grow our little, whatever, potatoes and onions. Compare the amount of biomass in a system to potatoes and onions right down here in the annual part of the transition line, to how much biomass there is right at the other end, when we've got huge, trees weighing hundreds of tons, transferring huge quantities of oxygen and water and carbon dioxide, and manufacturing enormous amounts of biological energy. There's very little happening down here. So one of the things that we could perhaps observe is that a lot of our farming and cultivating systems, they really could be a lot more productive. And there's another problem, is that when we have exposed that soil, when we've done the ploughing and the what have you to create the bare soil, we're losing a lot of our carbon. That soil carbon is being burnt off by the sun. There's the oxygen in the atmosphere, there's the carbon in the soil, CO2, off it goes. That's all your compost, your humus, the things that you've been trying to accumulate in your soil, disappearing, leaving the system. Every time we disturb the soil, every time we plow it, we're losing a lot of that, not just the soil carbon and maybe the humidity, but also think about when we plow, how much we're going to disturb the soil life, the microbes, the mycelium. We'll get into that a bit more tomorrow. So very quickly, these annual plants, so their job is to clothe and protect the soil as quickly as possible, so that it's no longer bare. Their job, what they're trying to do is to grow to seed as quickly as they can to be there available for the next generation. And they leave their seeds in the soil, blowing around, eaten by insects or birds, whatever, ready for when they're needed again. So they live and die. They hold the nutrients, prevent the soil from being damaged, and then slowly the succession starts, and we get more perennial plants start coming in, perennial plants and grasses, things that live longer and will protect the soil over a longer period of time. And then they start to give away to shrubs. Shrubs being a plant with woody material, maybe multi-stemmed, but it has wood. It has this builds up its structure over time, as opposed to the herbaceous plants which die away to their roots or to their seeds. So now we've got more carbon trapped in the system over a longer period of time. We've got, because there's now plants there permanently, those plants are pushing sugars into the soil, feeding the microbes, energizing the soil, which means it can then support longer term, more complex plants. And we move from shrubs and baby trees into fast growing trees, maybe softwoods, which might slowly give away to really much longer term elements within the system, like big hardwood trees, again, which represents a massive, much more interactions, much more energy going on within there. Within this succession, what permaculture people have kind of noticed is that, okay, so when we reach climax forest, this climax forest is almost carbon neutral. It's giving off carbon and absorbing it, but almost in a balance. So it becomes stable. And the amount of growth starts to slow down. But somewhere between this stage of the succession and here, somewhere across in this part, there's the most amount of carbon sequestration. There's the most amount of growth. You can see, you've seen young trees, how they can shoot up, how quickly they can shoot up. And this is where the forest gardening idea came from. This was the idea, the realization that perhaps instead of just being obsessed with this first part of the transition, the succession, we could look more at this part, this middle part of the succession, because it's more diverse. it's got more three-dimensional aspects to it. There's more structure. We've got layering, what we might call stacking in permaculture. We've got 3 dimensions happening to a system now. We've also got layers of plants. We've got ground cover plants. We've got small shrubs. We've got small trees, understory trees, moving to overstory. So there's much more biomass here. There's much more interactions going on. There's more energy being trapped, more photosynthesis going on. So perhaps if we model our farming systems more, we looked slightly further down the succession, this middle part, we might be able to produce a lot more from the same space. So there's a thought. I'm not against annual plants. They're a very important part of our diet, but can we more integrate them more into like forest systems? Because these forest systems are building soil and providing a lot more habitat for wildlife and biodiversity, and such more connections within it. So we can also think about time stacking. We've talked about the 3-dimensional nature of a system, a stacked system. But let's also think that the life cycle at this end of the succession is months. Some plants can grow to seed just in a few weeks, a month or two. Others then live for a year or two, 3 years, 5 years, 20 years. Maybe the shrubs and small trees live 25 years, 80 years, 100 years. So if you like, we've got fast carbon cycles, we've got slower carbon cycles, slower again. Now we've got really long-term carbon cycles happening over maybe hundreds of years. And we can think about, you know, the implications of that, and think about forests as long-term carbon stores, but also the soils underneath them. Okay. Next slide. I just touched on this before. It's such an important point. But evolution, the main driver of evolution is specialism, not competition. Species are evolving away from each other, so they're not all trying to occupy the same space. This idea that evolution, the survival of the fittest, it's the big punch up, big competition, is actually, that's not how it works. In some ways, parts of it are competitive. The lion chases the antelope and eats it. But actually, the lion sits and analyzes the whole flock of antelope for hours or days. And they wait until there's a weakness. They wait until they can see one with a wobbly leg, or one that's, you know, not paying attention, that's straying from the herd. And they'll pick that one off. And they'll eat it, and they'll all eat it. And then once they've eaten, the herd is completely calm again, because they know that the lions have fed. It's not like they're going to go and decimate them all. So there's a lot of specialism. Okay, so this is an air plant. I took this photo in the humid tropics in the Caribbean. So there's so much humidity in the atmosphere there that plants can grow quite big without even having roots. They can condense the air the moisture that they need out of the air. And actually, condensation is a very, very important part of the hydrological cycle. And a lot of plants utilize that air, the water that condenses out of the air, much more than we realize. Anyway, look how this plant has little fronds. Actually, it looks like a tightrope walker to me. You know, when the tightrope walker has their pole to balance, and it looks to me like it's balancing on this power line. And also you can imagine how, especially in the morning, droplets of condensation would form on these fronds of the plant, and they flow down them into the heart of the plant, which absorbs and holds that water. It can now photosynthesize, grab carbon out of the atmosphere, and build more plant. It's growing on a power line. Do you think that this air plant had evolved specifically to live on power lines? No, but it's advantageous. It has an ability to take advantage of new conditions, and that because it's taking advantage of new conditions that other plants have not yet accessed, it's in full sun. It's not competing with anybody. It's not shading out any other plant. It can absorb as much solar energy as it wants, or as much humidity will allow it. So there it can go, it can grow. So And I saw that and I thought, there's a really good example of what perhaps Charles Darwin was telling us about this evolution rewarding those species that are adaptive to new conditions. So I think as permaculturalists, we need to be adaptive to new conditions, to changing circumstances, to see opportunity everywhere. In fact, we are surrounded by insurmountable opportunity. And sometimes when systems are distressed or changing, then if you can spot those niches, spot those opportunities, you have a distinct advantage. This was on the same, this was quite a few years ago now. A friend of mine used to work with in Reading at the Reading International Solidarity Centre. He had his 50th birthday and he decided we were all going to go, him and a bunch of his friends, to Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and read this beautiful place. And I felt really guilty flying all that way just for holiday. So I bought loads of books about peak oil and energy descent and read them all on the plane. And whilst I was there, I took as many photos of tropical systems as I could to justify my air miles. So I keep using these slides because it makes me feel slightly less guilty about having this lovely holiday. So you're going to see loads of photos of Trinidad. But more seriously is this the same process I showed you in the car park, actually, but here it is on a beach. And I thought about this a lot when I was looking at it. I was imagining this was like a sandbank or something. Imagine there's some devastation, humans cause a mess, destroy an ecosystem. And we would take it back to bare soil, take it back to whatever it was. And as after all of that destruction, the sea's there, and in comes floating in the seed to start the succession again. And nature is peppered everywhere you go with seeds dormant in the ground. You know, a dock seed can sit there dormant for 80 years. 80 years waiting for the right conditions. Well, I don't know how long this coconut had been bobbing around in the sea, but it's lodged on the beach, on the sandbank. It's germinating. It's now starting to pull in carbon dioxide, access the moisture in the soil, build a new coconut tree. And as the tree establishes itself, that same thing's happening. Is the leaf litter and the detritus that's blowing around in the wind is accumulating around the tree, building a mulch, covering the soil, helping it catch and store energy and to grow. So I just thought, in some way, nature's just irrepressible. No matter how much kind of damage we do to it, it's always trying to come back. It's always trying to clothe and cover the soil. And this succession process is forever going on. So very, very important to think about how we work with that strategically. That's what we need to do. Okay. This is the view of Llyn Kai, looking down from the top of Cadair Idris. It's a few years since I went up there. It was a really beautiful day. So succession. The landscape, nature, left to its own devices, will build a forest. Where's the forest? I'm looking across the whole of the Welsh landscape here. I don't see a single forest. Where are the trees? Where have they gone? Well, we know, we already talked about it yesterday, is this is a sheep desert. This is a national park. This is on the top of a mountain, but there's still sheep there. And for as much as that's part of the productivity of the landscape, and it's a very important part of the economy of Wales, is I think it could be managed better. I think there could be more zoning. I wonder again, what's the real value? How many lambs you're getting off this hillside? And perhaps the ecological damage that they're causing is not worth the cost. And perhaps there's other things that we could do. So this slide's a little bit about limiting factors. And we'll expand on that as an idea as well later on, but nature wants to be abundant. Nature wants to be diverse, complex, three-dimensional, stacked systems, dynamic, interconnected. That's nature's default. It's always moving to that. And if it's not achieving that, why not? There's something that's holding it back. What is it? Because it might be there's not enough light, there's not enough rain, there's not enough basic genetic material, there's an absence of nutrient. Or maybe there are predator species or grazing animals which are preventing the succession from happening. So this is what is happening here. This is the sheep preventing the succession from happening. And over time, the landscape becomes more and more simplified. This is actually down by Thinkai, so it's down, actually probably down here somewhere, back down further down the valley, down here somewhere, is this. This is an experiment that someone has done. And I just observed this walking past. I've walked up that mountain a lot of times over the years. They have very cleverly created and installed a sheep exclusion device, a strategy for excluding sheep. What we've got is some fence posts and some sheep netting. Okay, so if we exclude the sheep, there we are, there we've removed the limiting factor. How does the environment respond to that one small, elegant intervention? It gives us this. We've instantly got a much more diverse landscape. Look outside, we've just got grass, 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 grass and grass with some grass. Here we've got heather, we've got bilberry, we've got sedge grasses, we've got different kinds of grasses coming in. We've got sort of woody plants. You can see we're getting some more, the succession's now starting to happen. Compare this ground over here to this. Think about how many habitat opportunities there is in there for insects. Think about how many habitat opportunities there are for, I don't know, earthworms and things. Because this is now a more three-dimensional, open soil and landscape, this will catch and store more water, more rainfall. This land over here where the sheep are is continually being compacted. All those little hoof prints and things sort of tamping down the soil, making it harder for that soil to hold water. This now looks to me like a perfect seed bed for something like gorse to get established, or maybe some birch or rowan. Higher up in the mountains, often we get rowan as a pioneer species. Rowan are very mobile, obviously, because they have those lovely red berries which birds love. There's rowan seeds everywhere. That to me looks like the seedbed ready now to become the next step of the succession. Now the rest of this landscape is being held in at a very, very early, simple stage of its potential development because of too much grazing. So, you know, when we go and look at the figures and when we know that we've lost 70% of the insects in the last 20 years or something, however it is, some terribly frightening statistic, this is why. Because there's no habitat for them here. And if there's no insects, then there's no birds. There's no birds breeding, and then there's no top predators feeding off those birds either. We simplify the whole ecology right back to step one of the succession. We're back here somewhere, where at least within the bit that we're looking at is here. You can see we're further down the line. Further down the succession means more complexity, more carbon sequestration, more interactions. So these are questions these are just observations. So we've learned something about limiting factors. We're thinking a lot deeply about succession. Okay, this is about stacking. This is about three-dimensional systems. And there's another picture from Tobago. Tobago is beautiful, I gotta say. It's just off the island just off Venezuela. And it's the southernmost, Trinidad and Tobago, the southernmost part of the Caribbean island chain. Trinidad is the richest island in the Caribbean. They've got oil, and Tobago is just a little island just off it. They mainly the Trinis. They call them Trinis. The Trinidadians go there a lot for weekends and beaches and stuff. Tobago was the very first tropical rainforest reserve in the world. 200 years ago, some geezer who was part of the British colony, they were logging the forest to plant indigo and cocoa. And he realized that it was affecting the ecology of the island. It was changing the rainfall. And he went back to UK and he lobbied his MP, who was the MP for Cambridge 200 years ago. And they got permission to create the world's first rainforest reserve. And it's on Tobago. So there you go. So we're staying in this place, very, very beautiful. Trying to learn lessons from it, observe. So look, here's just a branch of a tree. We're in this system. But look how every part of the branch of this tree is, you know, there's lichens and mosses, lichens. All of this is mosses here, look. Look how in the crevices of the bark, in the same way as the cracks in the pavement that we saw in that car park in Reading, it's giving the same processes are happening. Organisms where there's a bit of trapped water, they can live and grow, live and die, build a little bit of humus, and then that allows a succession for the next plant to come in. This succulent is just growing off the tree. And again, there's enough humidity and there's enough a nutrient just there for that plant to get established. Look, there's an air plant working on the other side. So again, this is an idea about stacking, how nature, there's an idea within permaculture, which is this: you can always add one more species to a system. Because now we've got this succulent, there's little pockets of water that catch maybe in the bases of the leaves. Maybe there's little organisms that live in that. Maybe there's a parasite that lives off that organism, and there's a bird that eats that parasite. And on it goes, building up in complexity. So maybe there's no upper limit to production. Maybe there's no upper limit to what an ecosystem can achieve. Or maybe we haven't found that upper limit yet. Because when you go into things like the Amazon rainforest, or say some of these tropical systems, is that the amount of productivity is just simply vast and mind-boggling. This is looking up, standing underneath a huge tall canopy tree, looking up into it. And what we're seeing is it's so covered in succulents, you can hardly see the tree. Succulents get to a certain size, and then they drop down these aerial roots, because then they do need to get some more water and moisture to be able to continue. So we start getting this complex, really three-dimensional layered environment, which allow niches for more and more species to find their way in, more and more edges for them to purchase on and find a space. So let's also realize, let's also think about plants as communities. That they're creating the conditions for things to live on them and in them and around them, that plants are creating the conditions for other plants to come in. So let's stop thinking of them as individuals. Let's realizing that plants operate as communities or guilds. And we'll get into the idea of plant guilds later on. A very, very important part of realizing, especially as we want to move away from agriculture with chemicals. And so if we can't meet the needs of a plant, how is that plant going to find the nutrients or the conditions, the pest regulation, other things that it needs? It finds them by building associations with other plants, with other species. So when we talk about ecology, I think the word ecology was kind of coined originally back in the Victorian era to describe the relationship between things. Because it's like, if you just look at the thing, there's the tree, there's the succulent, we'll just look at them in isolation, we are missing the interaction between the two. And that's the bit that makes it work. So here's a simple example that Paul Stamets uses in one of his talks. And he's talking about in the geysers, the hot springs in Yellowstone Park, there's a grass that can grow in this very hot water of these hot springs. And they ask themselves, whether plant biologists, what conveys, what is it that gives the thermal tolerance to this grass? Because normally we wouldn't see it growing in such an environment, in this hot spring. So let's study it. They took samples of the grass, they brought it into the laboratory, and they wanted to study it in isolation to understand the properties of the plant. As they were working with it, they realized it was contaminated with a fungi, that there was a fungi within the plant that was destroying, messing up their scientific processes. So they eliminated the fungi so they could study the plant in isolation. And then they realized that it didn't have the thermal tolerance without the fungi. Its ability to survive in that difficult environment was because of the relationship it had with the fungi. So again, is trying to understand things in isolation misses the important point that everything's connected, and that plants and different organisms are forming associations to allow themselves to operate in more complex and challenging environments. We can take some of these ideas now, stacking three-dimensional, complex, layered ecosystems, and bring them into a garden. This guy, Mike Guerra, he was a first-generation permaculturist in the UK. He was a designer and someone who sort of allowed his imagination to go with him. So we've got raised beds, we've got vertical gardens, we've got layers of shrubs, layers of productivity at different layers, at different stages. We've got what looks like some big, nice leafy vegetables here, some shrubs are going up. We've got climbers on the wall of this garden. This is a tiny garden in Surbiton in West London, by the way. We've got raised bed down the middle. It's like cabbages in there. We've got climbing beans. We've got plants in pots. We got a structure here with a hanging basket on it. We've got hanging baskets hanging off the hanging basket. We've got cascades of productivity. We've got another hanging basket here. In fact, he's copying this. This was his template. This is if nature can do that, what can we do? Okay, lessons that we learn is in our temperate climate, we have to place things further apart to let the light in. We're not in the tropics. We can't quite emulate these tropical systems, but we can emulate the patterns, and we could just spread things out a little bit and we get a bit more productivity. In our climate, because we have a lot of humidity, if we put plants together too much, too close, we can start to get issues with disease and fungal infections and things. But all of those points aside, is the point of this slide still remains, which is like we can model off nature. We can create productive landscapes very differently from a field, and we can copy the structure of a forest and bring that into a garden. So there's a principle here, and this is a Bill Mollison principle, but the yield of a system is theoretically unlimited. You know, how many more elements could we stack into that to add another layer of productivity? So the only limit of the number of uses of a resource possible is the limit of information and imagination of the designer. So if you're building this garden and you have a deficit of information, you might reach your limit, or you might run out of imagination. If you can keep thinking and keep designing, maybe you can always add another element, just maybe. It's a thought. Okay, so we've touched on symbiosis. I showed you the termite and the giraffe yesterday. This is another one from the Caribbean. Here's a termite's nest, a different kind of termite's nest in the crook of a tree. Why it's there, I don't know. Maybe there's flooding or something. But what I did notice and what fascinated me was the termites make tunnels out of clay. Look at this. You can see it on the underside of the tree. Look, this tube. This is a clay tube, and it links into the nest. And you can see there's all sorts of other ones all over the tree. I can see them going up here on the branch. The termites make themselves with earth from the ground. They make little clay tubes that they can run around inside of where they're safe. They don't get dried out by the hot sun and don't get eaten by birds. If you annoyingly break the tube with your finger, within a few minutes, some termites will arrive. They'll be a bit annoyed and they'll immediately start fixing it again. I just thought this was really, really interesting. But one of the things I thought was, it's rather like the circulation in your body, and this idea about nature repeating patterns. And what we're seeing again is a relationship between two different organisms, completely separate, but one is the structure for the other, one is the home for the other, and whatever the job that the termite might do for the tree, it might be the same as in the acacia. It protects the tree from being eaten too savagely by other browsing animals. But again, think about the complexity and the intimacy of this mutually beneficial relationship. Sometimes it's hard to even recognize that a species is in fact a multiple set of things living together. It's not just. So again, the tree needs this relationship for its own long-term success, and it provides then the perfect habitat for the termite. As far as the termite's concerned, the tree is its home. It owns the tree, or does the tree own the termite? It's all relative. It's all relative, but it's very important. It's very interesting to see how that relationship is and how it forms, and how patterns reoccur. All of that is fascinating to me. So another key principle. Again, this is another Mollison-ism. Relative locations. Relative location. Components placed in a system are viewed relatively, not in isolation. We recognize that there's a functional relationship between components. So it's the same as the grass with the fungi, or the tree with the termite. There's a functional relationship between them. Everything's connected to everything else, so we need to recognize the functional relationship between elements. So again, as we're designing and building systems, we need to allow associations to happen, because it might be beyond the knowledge of you as a designer of what's going on. So, and again, through observation, what we might sometimes see as a problem is, oh, look, that insect is occupying that tree, but maybe it's good for the long-term health of the tree, because in nature, nothing's in isolation. Things are working together much more than you could ever realize. It's much less of a competition. It's more of a team effort than you ever really could realize. So these, again, key ideas. Diversity. As a general rule, as systems mature, they become increasingly diverse, both in space and time. So again, you think for that bare wall, starting off with a few lichens on it, and then we moved through a birch forest to a long-term, whatever, oak forest. That system's become more diverse, both the space it occupies three-dimensionally and time. We've had elements that lived for only weeks or months, and now we've got elements that live for years and decades and maybe hundreds of years. So what is important is the complexity of the functional relationships that exist between the elements, not the number of elements. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? It's not about how many species you've got in your system. It's not just a numbers game. It's how many relationships are there. The system gets stronger the more interconnected it is. I don't know, if we were all in the same room and I had a big ball of wool, we might do the web of life game. I don't know if you've ever done that. Kind of stand in a circle and you pass, we each identify, I'm the tree, you're the grasshopper, she's the bird, that one's the insect or the frog or the plant. And we go, well, the frog eats the insect. So there's a relationship between the frog and the insect. The insect lays its egg on the plant, and there's a relationship to the plant. We pass the wall between us, and we slowly build up a web of connections. You realize that each one of those elements, the frog, the insect, the plant, the tree, the bird, well, they're separate. They're all tied in to each other through these energy relationships, these functional relationships. And that's what builds an ecosystem. And the thing that makes the ecosystem strong isn't just simply that there are lots of elements in it. It's that there are functional relationships between those elements. And again, as you can imagine, in a successional situation, as an ecosystem develops over time, the complexity of those relationships also grows. So again, we don't necessarily want to go back to bare soil all the time, because it takes generations to build the complexity that makes for a stable ecosystem. I would say the real rule is no bare soil. Keep your soil covered at all times. Don't stand on it. And then it'll start to improve. So here we go. Here's an ecosystem. This is what nature does all by itself. I showed you Mabira Forest yesterday. This is part of the forest reserve in Tobago, and let's just have a look at it. Let's just look into that. It's not just a uniform, dark forest with high canopy trees. Look how three-dimensional it is. Look how, yes, there's our high canopy tree going right up here. Here's another one. But there's understory trees as well. There's another layer of trees underneath that. We've got some palms poking out, different kinds of shaped plants Here's a tall, emergent palm. Lots of herbaceous plants covering the ground. Every surface is covered in climbers, those opportunity plants that just grow wherever there's light. This whole, when I look at this picture, just think, those plants are creating as much surface area as they possibly can to trap as much of that solar energy as they can, to create as much sugar as they can, to feed the microbes in the soil as much as they can, to access the nutrients that they need to keep building the system. So that's what's going on. And it's happening on all these different layers, on all these different timelines, some very short, some really long. This is what we need to be emulating. So there's all different kinds of yields coming from here, but those yields are coming over short term, medium term, and long term timelines. Think about how many insects would be within this system. Think about how many birds would be in the system feeding on those insects. Think about the mammals that might be in there feeding off other, other elements in the system. And think about how those mammals accelerate the passage of nutrients through the system. So the more birds that the monkey's eating or whatever it is that they eat, the more they're returning those nutrients back to the forest floor, being absorbed by the soil microbes and returned to the trees. It's a very clever system. It's very hard to imagine anything falling out of here, being lost, because every element is being grabbed onto and held onto by the system itself. Interconnected, dynamic, strong, natural system. So we've seen, this is nature. What nature does, it seems to catch and store energy. This forest is built out of local resources. It's built out of the soil that was there. Okay, some things are blown in from the outside. Some seeds coming from the outside. Some seeds have been deposited in bird droppings and what have you. But basically, it's made out of what was there. Local and natural resources. It's an energy system that's designed to catch and store energy. It's built out of what was there. It uses only natural resources, so therefore everything is cyclable, so it produces no waste. These are unarguable observations to make, really. Produce no waste. Produce no waste is principle 6 in permaculture. Nature doesn't do it. Nature doesn't leave big piles of unutilized stuff. It always finds ways to reincorporate it back into systems. Somehow we humans have created linear systems where we dig something out of the ground, we use it, and we chuck it away. In fact, I think if you watch the story of Stuff, which is quite a short instructional video for kids, but it's very good. It created the Story of Stuff project, where they looked a lot more into the cyclical economy. But the average lifespan of a consumer item is, I don't know, it's hours, it's minutes, it's a couple of days. So from production to using it to being landfill, most stuff you buy within 3 days is being chucked away again. This represents an enormous waste of energy, also an enormous waste of resource. This is resource. We're throwing away. Look, these seagulls and things are seeing some value in it. This is Beddington landfill site. It's in Croydon in South London. It's 120, what was it? It was 40 acres of land, 40 acres of land that they're covering in 120 feet high pile of crap. I mean, it's just seeing the scale of it was just mind blowing. I actually spent a month there working on a TV program, and to see it once for a day was one thing, but to see it for a month, to see the queues. These lorries are as big as a lorry is allowed to be and be on the road. It's height, width, weight, all of that, length. And there's a queue of those from morning till night, just waiting, just constantly driving up there and dropping all their stuff off. They cover it in clay, they flatten it with big bulldozers and put mud on top of it. These pipes, as it catch some of the methane that comes out of it, it's just a kind of a nightmare. These are human systems. Nature doesn't do this. These are lessons that we need to get past. This is organic matter composted in the ground. It's actually toilet waste after a PDC. A year later, I came along. We'd used pine needles, and I dug it all out, and it was just beautiful, crumbly compost. And that's the difference between working with inorganic systems, organic systems. Organic waste breaks down to give you Peaches. It gives you compost, something that you can. That was the giant peach of whatever it was, like 2007 or something. Yes, so I'm trying to show the relationship between these things. Okay. Microclimate. This is about microclimate. Never underestimate the importance of microclimate. That the difference between here and here is 100%. What we're seeing is the frost shadow behind the building. This is just below Llanwddyn by Lake Vyrnwy, and it's one of those really cold December days, but it's bright and sunny as well. There's obviously been a heavy frost in the night, and here's the sun over here. You can see the shadow, so the sun's over here somewhere, and it's tracked across the sky from here to here as the day's gone by. Winter day, sun low in the sky. So this shadow, where the sun hasn't reached behind the church, hasn't thawed. So so we've got very, very different conditions between here and here, just a foot apart, because of that frost shadow. Or against the wall here, look here, there's still frost there as well, because the sun hasn't reached that part. So microclimate's a very important thing. And the more we create differences in a landscape, different edges and structures and different plants, the more varied it becomes, which means it can allow for more variety of species, for a longer stretched out harvest season, or many other aspects. So we try to work with microclimate and add differences, because it helps build diversity, but also is not to misunderestimate how much it might affect something, maybe in a productive system or something. So I've kind of tried to build up a list really of these observations, and I want us to be happy with these terms. Okay, so succession, we've got that now. I've laboured that point a bit. Stacking, we got that. Cycling, this endless, we don't say recycling in permaculture, we talk about, because that sounds like, oh, it's a big deal. I've used this once and now I've recycled it. It's like, no, all matter should cycle endlessly. There should be no landfill sites. One of the key elements or factors within our natural systems is that it's typified by mutually beneficial relationships, by symbiosis. Nature embraces and banks on diversity. There's lots of very subtle differences within the landscape, which are very interesting to work with aside of microclimate. If we work with local resources, biological, biodegradable resources, then that's what relates with the idea of cycling. These are very easy then to cycle, because even if I bring something from far away, I buy that cheap spanner from China and I use it and it breaks, I can't get it fixed, because it's not worth sending a broken spanner back to China. But if I bought it from within my community and I can take it back to the blacksmith and he can fix it, then I can cycle that element again. The thing that I haven't expanded on is this multiple function and elements. So I'll come back to that. I'll make a note not to forget that. Okay, and instead let's talk about edge. I like edges. I'm interested in edges. Permaculture is fascinated with edges. There's something called the edge effect. It starts quite simple. Let's start simple. Here's the edge effect. This is on the street in Machynlleth. Not that that's in any way relevant, but just it is. And this was just close to where I was living at one point. And I could walk up and down the street and I could observe the edge effect happening everywhere I looked. It's like, oh, edge effect, edge effect, edge effect, edge effect, edge effect. What is that? What are we seeing? Okay, some grass is growing out. Big deal, big deal. This is not a very likely environment, though, is it, to see succession building out from? We've got a concrete wall and we've got an asphalt pavement. And this is an electric conduit pipe. And imagine the wind blows, blowing around little bits of particulates. You can see it, little bits of soil and earth and dead leaf and twig. And as we get closer to the ground, as we get closer to the edge of the wall, there's more friction. The air is slowed down a little bit. And because it's slowed down a little bit, it can't carry as much material. So it drops it and it deposits. And where does it gather? At the edge, because there's friction there. There's purchase. There's something for it to stick to, if you like. So now as this accumulates, this organic matter is going to start breaking down, making compost, absorbing water when it rains, creates a seed bed now for herbaceous plants to start getting a little toehold in it. And if we just allow that process to run, they get more pronounced, they get bigger. And look, we can see that same process I mentioned before is, look, there's an overhang on this step. So there's a little bit more friction, there's a little bit more space, if you like, for the material to accumulate. As these plants grow, look, they start trapping the dead stuff blowing past. Then themselves, they create a bit more friction. So again, we're seeing succession starting to happen from an edge. Succession seems to come from edges. And we start from a very humble, a very humble start, but now we're already starting to get into a more complex ecosystem of little things happening there. Look a bit further up the road, we've got some mosses, we've got very established and some grasses. And again, a little mixture of plants there working together. And here they're working together so well, we're reaching the next stage of the succession. We're getting bigger herbaceous plants are now getting rooted into it. And look how important there's this mulch and the compost materials that are building up here. So it's all enabling the system to grow and develop. It's coming out of an edge. So if we leave that long enough, it's going to take over the whole street. Eventually, it will carpet over the whole street. So again, can we work with these things? Maybe these are things that we can use to design with, other ways that we can make little interventions that create more edges, that allow accumulation to happen, and for things to develop. It's a thought, isn't it? It really is. And I think this is something that's very much within permaculture. So I might be over-laboring this, but I'm going to go with this anyway, I stood and looked at this little damp corner for about an hour, thinking about it one day, many years ago. And I thought, interesting. I'm looking at a damp corner on a street in Machynlleth. Maybe, though, I could be looking down from a mountain at a huge landscape. What if this was 100 miles across rather than 10 centimeters across? We'd see the same processes, wouldn't we? Because look where there's moisture around, staying around on the edges, but it's slowly finding its way, flowing downhill through these little cracks. And where the moisture has accumulated, there's the mosses growing, there's the grass growing. And if we can interpret, say, just a damp little corner of a street, but imagine we could take that same observation and use it to look at a much wider, broader landscape. We could also begin to predict where the moisture would accumulate, where the soil might accumulate, and therefore where we might go and make an intervention into that system to either speed up that succession or to start creating yields from it, like through farming. Anyway, I won't go, yeah, anyway, so there's some thoughts about that. Now, here's a couple of other edge effects. Okay, let's do this one first. This is a gravel pit, and extracting gravel from it. And so bare soil, big diggers coming along, making a mess. And I think what we're seeing behind it is old gravel pits that have been grown over. So this is actually also Beddington landfill site. This is the thing that they're filling up with rubbish. But look what's happened is we've created an edge, we've dug a hole in the ground with a big digger, and that hole is filled with water because that's what happens, rain. All the species that have turned up to look at this, oh look, there's a hole in the ground with water in it. I wonder what's going on. These are all pioneer species. These birds are also doing that pioneering role. They're coming into a bare, landscape, and they are seeding it with nutrients. They are seeding it with seeds, literally. There might even be fish eggs and little, I don't know what, things in the down of these herring gulls, herons, blackbirds, not blackbirds, crows, Canada geese. Look, pioneer species. They're all coming in. What's going on here? And in the process of doing that, they're bringing seeds, nutrients, organic matter, DNA, and releasing it into there, which is actually allowing a guild of plants, a guild of species to kickstart and populate this area again. So these are edge effect species pioneering and actually helping accelerate succession again. So I sit there looking at this and thinking about that, spent my month in the Beddington landfill site. And I looked across to the edge of the landfill site, and this is the town of Beddington, and I saw these really bright coloured things there. Well, you can see there's red and yellow and blue things there, and they are they're the cowls of a ventilation system. And this is actually the BedZ building. It was built in 2000. It's the Beddington Zero Energy Development. It was the first zero carbon building built in the UK. And it's an integrated live, work, play, so you can cycle and you don't have to commute, and sort of multifunctional mixed use structure, passively heated, passive solar, and ventilation, all sorts of dynamic, interesting, creative eco technologies. So they invested this building. Where did they build this building? It's a trial, experimental, sort of edgy kind of development, right? Because it's new. Where did they put it? They put it on the edge of the landfill site, because the land's cheaper there. If you're pioneering, if you can see value in something that perhaps other people can't, and you can access something, it makes it more achievable. So this is a social edge, as a sort of technological pioneering social and building experiment happening here on the edge of a landfill site. I thought that was really interesting, and I thought about in my own journey is we started our first housing co-op, Chicken Shack, where on the coast, on the edge of the country, on the edge of Snowdonia National Park, on the edge between the cliffs, the sea, and the mountains. Why? Well, because it was cheap, because it was in a remote place. It was. We could see the value in it. We could see the potential in it, whereas others are just saw, oh, there's another bloody sheep farm. Not really that exciting. Not economically viable. It sat empty on the market for 4 years. So somehow opportunities can be on edges, and if you're a pioneer species, a pioneering project, pioneering individual, you might find your toehold on the edge. From there, you can create succession. These are important things to think about within design. So let's go back to Trinidad. Again, another quick visit to the tropics. We went here to see the red ibex, very beautiful, big pink, orange, red bird, fishing bird. And they fly, I think we're not far from the mouth of the Orinoco River here from Venezuela, and they fly across it as a channel, and they roost in these mangrove swamps in Trinidad. So we were there looking at these birds, and the kind of tour guide guys were saying to me, he said, this is one of the most biodiverse habitats in the whole world. And I thought, wow, that's cool, that's interesting. Why would it be biodiverse? It's got as many different species here as you could find anywhere. That's interesting, because it doesn't look that promising. It looks a bit messy. It's a mangrove swamp, bit smelly, bit messy. Why would we get so many different species here? Well, there's more edges, there's more microclimate, there's more difference, there's more different varying conditions for life here than just about anywhere. So you get is loads and loads of those specialist species that can live somewhere on this sort of spectrum of change, of microclimates. So here's the thing. This mangrove swamp is growing in an estuary, which means there's fresh water flowing in from a mountain and it's mixing with seawater, which is saline. And it's also, estuaries are tidal, so the saline water is going up and down. So one part of the day, it's inundated with salty water, and another part of the day, it's fresh water. So we've got an edge, we've got a gradation from 100% saline to 100% fresh. There are different little organisms, different little fish, different little whatever, that like every part of that, if you like, of that diversity of conditions. So we've got a certain kind of edge from fresh to salty, from high water to low water. That creates a set of different conditions. We've got very, very dense vegetation, and we've got open channels of water. So there's a very interesting edge here between the dense vegetation, where there's a lot of protection. This will be full of shrimps and prawns and crabs and fish fry, because they're safe in there, and the fish can go and lay their eggs there. But maybe the big predator animals, the big predator creatures can't swim into the dense vegetation because perhaps they're too big. So we get really, really good conditions for lots of species to proliferate. But as soon as they venture out, they become food for bigger, more predatory species. So we get lots and lots of different shrimp and crab and prawns on one side, and then we get big, I don't know, barracuda type things that like to eat them. So we've got layers upon layers, if you like, of microclimates and microhabitats. We've got aerial roots coming down, dividing and dividing, creating more and more edge. There's so many little insects and little crustaceans that like to live either just on the surface of the water or just below the surface of the water. There are things that can stand on the water, on the meniscus, there's the surface of the water, and move around on it. There's other things that can hang on that and feed themselves. And so again, it's think of all those interactions, things on top, in, underneath, all of these branching roots, edges and edges and edges, different conditions, different microclimates, which gives you maximum diversity. So there's lessons in this too. If we want to create diverse, stable environments, edges, differences, microclimates, this is part of our mindset for permaculture. Okay, these are going to take these away. So, and this was just a beautiful Hindu temple, male and female principle. I just took pictures. It's a nice place. It's again Trinidad. But a moment of reflection, contemplation. It made me think about ethics. It made me think about our own responsibilities as ethical people. And we went a little bit into the ethics yesterday. Bill Mollison says this: the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence, that of our children, or maybe our immediate community. That's to be that self-responsibility, the meeting your own needs, but to do it through cooperation, not competition. That the very basis of future survival and of existing life systems is cooperation, not competition. I'm going to go a lot into cooperatives. I'm a big fan of cooperatives. The person who created the very first cooperative, do you know where they came from? They came from Wales. They came from Newtown, actually, Michelle. Robert Owen. Newtown is the second town on the River Severn. So we had the guy who created the world's first co-op, River Severn, Newtown. The guy who decoded evolution, Shrewsbury, River Severn. and Abraham Darby, the guy who built the first blast furnace, also Ironbridge. Same valley, same interesting. Somehow, it's interesting. So cooperation is the thing and set limits to consumption. That's that thing about we have to meet our own needs. We have to meet our own needs through cooperation and not be greedy. Set limits to that so that we have a surplus, and with that surplus, we can build new things. We can go out and create new things. So I think okay. So now the one thing that I've overlooked, for some reason I haven't got it in as a slide. Let's go back to any picture will do. functions and elements. This is very important. So there's a function in nature which is decomposition, biodegradation. So things biodegrade, living matter as it dies biodegrades and becomes compost. That function, that biodegradation is a function within natural systems. Yeah, that element, that function is supported by multiple elements. What's an element? Element's a thing, it's an individual within that. So what are the processes that support and accelerate the biodegradation of organic matter? Well, it's weather, it's moisture, it's heat, it's bacteria, it's protozoa, it's amoebas, it's wood lice, it's flies, it's maggots, it's fungi, it's thermophilic bacteria, it's a lot of things. It's worms, of course, and of course there are lots of different kinds of worms. There are red worms that break down organic matter. There are pink worms that drag that organic matter into the soil. So each one of those is an element. The wood louse is an element. The worm is an element. The function is biodegradation. That function is supported by multiple elements. In nature, in design, if we want a system, something to be resilient, if we have a key function, biodegradation, your forest system will fail if it doesn't have that built into it. Key functions are supported by multiple elements. So let's say if we had a system of biodegradation and for some reason we didn't have wood lice, they weren't present, it would still work because we'd have all those other elements, the nematodes, the protozoas, the amoebas and things that are doing that breaking down. The flies, the maggots, the worms, they're all still doing their job. So there's a thing, there's a redundancy principle, is the system would still work perfectly well even if some of those elements were missing. As designers, if we identify a function in a design, we want to support that function with multiple elements. So if you're designing to create an intended outcome, you don't want that outcome just to be the product of one thing. Okay, you want that to be supported by multiple things. There's lots of examples of that. We'll come across that. Okay. So we want to support key functions with multiple elements. I just want a picture of a tree. Okay. Let's go back to this tree here. This next thing though is each element performs multiple functions. That's a different thing. So if we select, as designers, if you select an element to put in your system that does multiple functions, you're stacking the yields into your system. So I might plant a plant that fixes nitrogen into the soil, and that's going to help build the fertility for the next plant. But that plant that I've planted, it might also produce seeds, which I can use to feed animals with, or it might produce a lot of biomass, which I can again use for making compost. So if I can choose elements that perform multiple functions, I'm going to get many more yields out of my system. So we like to say in permaculture, if you can only think of one reason for doing something, it's probably not enough. If you can think of 2 or 3 reasons, then maybe. If you can think of 10 reasons for doing something, why haven't you done it already? You know, you should be on that. So again, we're trying to be strategic. We're designers. So let's go for the things where we can create the most benefit, where we can create the most yield or the most output. So within our design strategy, the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to support key functions with multiple elements. So let's say in my garden, in my piece of land, whatever it is I'm doing, is one of the functions is to give me money. I want to make a living. So I'm going to support that function with multiple elements. So within, I can grow some plants, I can grow some trees, I can grow short-term yields, medium-term yields, and long-term yields. I can put in some trees that I might harvest in 10 years or 20 years time. I can support my income function by, if I garden in such a way that I'm learning a lot, I can also get another yield from that because I can be a teacher. I can sell the knowledge that I gained from growing my carrots in an interesting way. I can now write a book about it or teach about it. How many different yields can we bring into a system to support that function of making income? If I'm growing, I want to have good soil. One way to get good soil is to do lots of mushrooms. If you grow lots of mushrooms, mushrooms create soil because they biodegrade organic matter. They support your function of income. So I'm selling the mushrooms or eating the mushrooms, but also they're giving me compost, and that compost goes into my garden, which supports the long-term function of the garden too. So we're trying to, in our strategic thinking as permaculture designers, we want to support functions of multiple elements, and we want to choose elements we put into our systems that perform multiple functions. Okay, so that's that one. I wanted to keep that as a thought, and there we go. That's pretty much it. Here's a thought from David Holmgren. A reunion of culture and nature. Permaculture design principles can never be a substitute for practical experience and technical knowledge. However, they may provide a framework for continuous evaluation of the site and situation-specific solutions necessarily to move beyond the limited successes of sustainable development to a reunion of culture and nature. David's pretty deep, actually. You have to kind of go away and think a lot about what when he says. But it's saying, look, I'm showing you the patterns. We're looking at the patterns, not the detail. So that doesn't make us experts yet. It still takes years and decades to become a really experienced grower or forester or landscaper or something like that. There's no shortcut. There's no substitute for practical knowledge and practical experience and technical knowledge. But by being able to see the patterns, it does give a framework for evaluation, and it gives us a way to actually understand these bigger processes. And this seems to be a very, very important part. He's sort of also getting a dig in there about sustainable development isn't really enough. We're into regenerative development, and which he calls a reunion of culture and nature. So there we go. That's what we're trying to get to. And there's David's 12 principles. So David's sort of summarized all of these things, if you like. He's allowed these principles of natural systems. That's what I call this list. And he's allowed those principles, observations, to inform his 12 principles of permaculture. In fact, especially the first 6, very much based on these observations. So there we go with that. 1204. If we just go back to small and slow solutions. Yeah, on page 28, I've summarized these things as well. So just again, save your notes. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Observing natural systems. So we've got succession, no bare earth. Key functions are supported by multiple elements. Elements perform multiple functions. Cycling or no waste, local resources, natural resources, biodiversity, microclimate, edge, stacking, symbiosis. These are all the key observations of natural systems. And look, I put in a few pictures around, some of which we've seen. That lichens off Lake Vyrnwy Dam, beautiful white lichen on a grey rock. It's very beautiful. And there's that same street in Machynlleth. I've also got multiple functions for my photos. I use them in lots of different incarnations. But anyway, there we go. So there's us building an empathy for natural processes and natural systems. Yeah, we've done all of that. Okay. Okay, how's everybody feeling about that? Is that okay? That's quite a lot of stuff. Good. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Good. I want to, and Sean's getting the thumbs up too. That's great. Okay, good. So we've got a little bit of time to go before lunch. We've got about 55 minutes. Does anybody just need 5 minutes just to have a shakeout? Just we'll just take 5 minutes. It is 6 minutes past 12, and we'll make sure we're back by quarter past or something like that, or 11, 12 minutes past. Just give you a few minutes, okay? See you in a sec. Recording. Okay. I'm going to do a 40-minute presentation, tell a story. So Chimanimani is a district in Zimbabwe. It's a mountainous area, 5,000 feet above sea level, rising up to maybe 8,000 feet. And it's on the very edge between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And there's that part of that sort of the rift mountain chain going down Africa. So within the Chimanimani district, there's a little town called Chimanimani, but it's a district, quite a big area, mountainous area, and there's one of the districts within it is called Chikukwa, and there's a little village, and there's actually a series of 7 villages in the Chikukwa Valley, and they're habited by the Chikukwa clan of people. And I lived in this area for a couple of years, 1990 till 1992. So a long time ago now, 30 years ago, oh my God. And it was where permaculture discovered me when I first came into contact with permaculture. And there's a whole story about that, which I'll tell another time, perhaps. But anyway, Zimbabwe is an amazing place, I have to say. It was the last, I did this big trip traveling around Africa. It was the last country that I went to, the last new country that I went to. And once I got there, I instantly felt that was the place that I'd been looking for. I wanted to stay. After 2 years of being there, I actually applied for citizenship and tried to get a work permit, and I started my own business there. I was making cheese and teaching permaculture. And the person who drew this picture, what you're seeing, this design is the #1 selling T-shirt for tourists. It's a design created by an artist called Kevin Huff. He's originally South African. He lived most of his life in Zimbabwe. And meeting Kevin changed my life. Just like that. Sometimes, you have to let go of the familiar to go out into unfamiliar places to make new connections. And that was kind of what I did when I went off traveling around Africa. And I met someone who connected me to a world that I was not familiar with. Someone who lived most of their life there and was connected to the place and had all sorts of insights into what was going on. I was just a tourist really passing through. Anyway, Kevin passed away now, sadly, in a house fire some years ago. He left this design to an AIDS orphan charity in Zimbabwe. So he then created a legacy that can still be reinvesting back into the community that he loved. So again, there's something about giving back and stuff like that. He was an extraordinary guy, but it's not really what this lecture's about. But I just wanted to mention it because this was a very personal journey for me. I'll also say something a little bit about history. Is in some way around, I don't know when, 1986, he said, guessing, Bill Mollison ran a course, a PDC, in Botswana. Botswana's a country to the west, one country to the west of Zimbabwe. And he ran a PDC there. And I think there were 4 people on that course from Zimbabwe. And I've met all of them. And each one of them went away and started an initiative Someone started a training center in Harare called Fambids and I. Another person created the permaculture, I don't know, network of Zimbabwe. They did a whole bunch of stuff anyway. So again, it's very interesting to think about hardy pioneers. These hardy pioneer people started to create a permaculture world, permaculture ecosystem environment within Zimbabwe. Now, you will know that in the years since the 90s, since the mid-90s, that have been difficult and challenging times in Zimbabwe, that they have all sorts of whatever challenges, dysfunctionality within there. And that for all of the hard times that people have endured, it's the permaculture projects and areas that have survived the best. And in some ways, the economic challenges that they've faced has forced people to focus and double down on building from local and natural resources, creating resilience by design from available resources. So it's interesting that sometimes adversity really forces you to focus on what's important. Because one of the things that I've noticed over the years of teaching permaculture, I did restart the thing, didn't I? Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed over the years of teaching permaculture is that when you teach it to African people, broad generalization, of course, they tend to immediately act on it. They start using it in what they're doing almost straight away because it makes sense, because it's kind of, obvious, it's important. Whereas a lot of the people in the first world who I teach, they say to me, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to file it away in between cricket and opera under interesting, not necessarily acting on it straight away, or maybe with great a sense of urgency, because we have so many options. We're not just dependent on the land for our food. We've got jobs, we've got savings, we've got a house, we've got social security. We can sign on. We can do all these things that actually people in Africa can't do. They have fewer options. So when you give them something, an idea that really works, they go with it. They go over it and they build on it quite quickly. So some of the most successful, most interesting and exciting permaculture projects in the world in Africa. They're in places where there's a bit more adversity and where people are a bit more focused on what it is that they have to do. If anybody's interested in Africa, I can connect you to some incredible people and projects, and people who just would really value interactions with people from the outside world. And if ever you feel like donating or wanting to have a role supporting really hardy pioneer people, active people who are making massive differences to their communities, I can help make those connections. So I'd mention that. Okay, here we go. This is Chikukwa Valley. This is several hours drive from the nearest road. Okay, the road ends at the town of Chimanimani, and this is, let's say, 2 or 3 hours down a dirt track. So when it's rained, or when it's been bad weather or something, it might be impassable. Plus, when I visited this community in 1991 or 92, the only people in the whole valley who had a car was one pair of German teachers who they come out to do something equivalent of like VSO or something, and they so connected with the Mashona people in Zimbabwe that they'd given up their German passports and they'd actually become fully integrated into the tribe and living in kind of, the same conditions as everybody else. And the one thing really differentiated them was that they still had a car, but anyway, it's irrelevant really. Let's look at a big landscape. So we're looking at one homestead. Here it is. Here's a little homestead. Well, quite often African homes are a cluster of little of structures, maybe. It's within a big valley. There's only about 7 communities within this valley, within the Chikukwa district, and maybe 7,000 people live there in all, approximately. I don't know. This was a long time ago that I was there. These are not my pictures, by the way. I lifted them from someone else's, from a magazine. But I've been to this place. I've met the people. I feel an absolute connection to it. So I want to tell you the story. So firstly to say is this is what a landscape looks like when it's just about to break down, when it's just about finished. And what I want you to notice is bare soil, bare soil, bare soil, bare soil, pathways, pathways, bare soil. Look, between these clusters of tussocky grass, bare soil everywhere is that's bare soil. I suppose you get a lot of bare soil around compounds and things, bare slopes. This isn't good, really, and also is, where are the trees? No, on these steep slopes. Look, on these steep slopes, no trees, no trees. Steep slope. Look how the slope. Whoops, the slope. Whoops, that's not very good. Clear that. Also, the slope of the land is something a bit like this. The higher slopes are what we would call convex, and as we go a bit lower, it becomes a bit more concave. We'll look at that a bit further on as well. But this point where the convex moves to concave, there's this sort of point here in the landscape here, that's the settlement line. That's where often you see the habitat. And that's because water that's percolated into the ground below and coming against rocks, so slowly that water moves under the soil, soaks down deep into the soil, and it starts to come out. And along this line, just below the inflection line, this point here, you get springs forming. So maybe we get springs here. Water that's soaked into the land higher up comes out, starts oozing out and becoming available. So so the settlement often is where the water is, because there's no taps here, there's no mains. They're working off well water. So over time, here's another thing we need to know, a little bit of history is the Mashona people are settled pastoralists. They like to graze cows and they grow a few crops. They live in the highlands of Zimbabwe, and the highlands of Zimbabwe is some of the most fertile and productive land in the world. They can have 2 or 3 crops a year there. It's so because it's high up, it's cool. So you have the advantage of the sun. You get rain, but it's not so very hot. So it makes it very, very nice. Altitude in the tropics, really, really good. So of course, when the British came there, especially a lot of them, they came in between the wars, but also after the war, and they displaced most of the Mashona people out of the good farmlands and pushed them onto more marginal land on these slopey, much steeper sloping land that they wouldn't have traditionally farmed. This is marginal, this is an edge, this is steep. And they brought with them a farming system that was not adapted for this kind of environment also, we can say that too. So what's happened is, over time, they're growing crops maybe further down the valley, and over the time, their animals, their grazing animals, sheep, goats and cattle, they've harvested the wood for firewood, they've not replaced it. Grazing animals have stopped the natural regeneration, so we've lost the forest. Maybe it took 80 years, but we've lost the forest. Now we've lost the forest, the soils are becoming more and more exposed, they're becoming more eroded. We're starting to get bare soil. Bare soil in the tropics is a really bad thing. It's obviously going to get cooked, it's going to break down very quickly. Sun is so strong, dries it out, breaks down the carbon. So one day in 1991, a person living in his house went to the well and it was empty. There was no water. The only thing that you can do then is to walk further down the valley and carry water uphill. If anyone of you's tried that, that's not a fun thing to do. Water is heavy, it's a difficult thing to carry, and even a few litres is really heavy, and we lose a lot more than that each day. So as soon as you're carrying water uphill, you know you're close to the end. Maybe it was just at the height of the dry season. Maybe the rain came back a little bit the next season, but the point was, this is a distressed landscape. It's drying out, it's breaking down. This is a problem. by 92, there's starting to be malnutrition in this area where there hadn't been before. Kids with their ribs sticking out, swollen bellies, all of that stuff starts to happen. Very sad. Young, able, smart people, what do? They get on the bus, they go to Johannesburg, they go to Harare, they go to Joburg, they try and get a job. So you get a brain drain as well. So this is a community that's breaking down, and we're losing our human resource as a result of the natural resources being eroded by an inappropriate farming strategy, which has been done over 80 years. Now, interestingly, so Chikuku was still a traditional area. You know, like Zimbabwe, when it was Rhodesia, was managed a bit like apartheid South Africa. They had white towns and black townships, and the indigenous people, the Africans, had tribal areas that they were. If you didn't have a job, if you didn't have a reason to be in the city, you can go sit in your mud hut and you can grow maize and not whatever. That was their attitude. So this is a tribal area, which means also, though, that it's managed in a traditional way. There's a council of elders of the sort of chieftains and what have you. I don't know what exactly the right title would be, but they're the people who make these decisions about how society is managed there. So again, this is very different to think about a farm here where someone owns one bit and another one owns another bit. Here, this is a community asset, as if you like, it's held by chieftains, and obviously you have a right to cultivate a certain part. But it's in some ways it's slightly more cohesive communities. One of the Future Generations Act goals. Okay, so no water in the well problem. What's the solution? Go to Harare, go to Fambizanai, go and take some permaculture classes. 3 or 4, 5 or 6, I don't know, few hardy pioneer people from this community went away and came back with new information. And again, what would you do? What would you do if you were in this kind of a situation? It's fair to imagine. And what they learned, and what they came back with the idea of, was to transform the landscape in a way in which had never occurred to any of them at all. This was a completely new way of thinking, because they just hadn't had a chance to think like this. What they were told is you need a plan, you need a long-term plan, and you need to stick to it. The problems that you're experiencing in this valley are not short-term problems. Yeah, Sean's saying plant trees. Yeah, we need to plant some trees for sure. There's a problem though, is that there's goats everywhere, and there's cows, and so we're also going to have to incite and support the community to change their behaviors. Well, yeah, get rid of the grazing animals. Fences are expensive, Sean, when you think about it. So yeah, these were all things. So one of the things that they had to do was goats must be tethered. If I see a goat eating my land and eat on my plants and it's not tethered, I can take it home and milk it, because that's now my milk, if you like. These were kind of, they started to come up with ideas and initiatives that maybe start to address their problems. Yeah, living fences and things. So many things that we could begin, see, elements that we might be able to incorporate into a system. So if you like, all of the things you were suggesting, Sean, are like individual elements, individual things that we can bring into the system. But what we need now is this big overarching plan. So this is what they did. Oops. This is the same landscape. This is the same view. So again, I'm going to highlight a few things. We're looking from a different side, obviously. Let's say that's the homestead we were looking at, or that is there, something like that. Where's my pen? Okay, so firstly is, let's just go back and this, what I was trying to say about the shape of the land. Look, oh, that's not what we want. Oh, anyway, why I lost my pen? Oh, there, no. Oh, never mind. I'll get over it. But look, the shape of the land, look, it's steep here. Look how steep it is on the upper slopes. and then it comes steep, 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 and then it goes much less steep. So that's the convex moving to concave, right? That's the slope of the land. So this is one of the things that they were taught. Once the steepness of the land gets beyond 18%, then it's too steep to farm and it needs to be trees. So all of this up above the settlement line on these steeper slopes becomes forest. And no more grazing of cattle up there, no more just allowing them to wander. We're going to keep the cattle in other areas. They're going to be more managed, more corralled, and we're going to grow fodder crops for them instead. Okay, so you can see how much of this plan to manage the landscape was consensus building. It was lots of discussion. They had so many meetings. They had so many, so many discussions. And in Zimbabwe, when you have a meeting, you have to observe all these protocols. When you arrive, you greet everybody, you clap, you sing songs, you share food. Some of that food you pour on the ground for the ancestors. You recognize everything that happened before to get you to where you are then, and then you think about where you're going to be afterwards. It's a very circuitous, kind of complicated culture, but you can see the functions that might perform. Then the next thing what you're seeing is look, what are these lines? Somebody's been busy. They have built miles and miles of. It's a little ditch and a bank. It's called a swale, and it's a way of interrupting the flow of water downhill. So once we've got off the really steep slopes, and we're now at 20 degrees, 18 degrees less slopes, we can start putting swales in. And what we can notice is there's a line of swales here, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. Each one of these it's a ditch and a bank. So look, this is how a swale works. There's our ditch, there's our bank. So the flow of water that comes down the hill, because gravity, we get surface water flow. When you get heavy tropical rain, and boy does it rain heavily here. So in Zimbabwe, they go 9 months of the year, 10 months of the year with nothing. It just gets hot and dry every day. It's a beautiful hot sunny day. And then just as it's getting too hot, you start getting really, really heavy rain, and it chucks it down. You can imagine how that water, the destructive force of that water, if it's not soaking into the ground, if it's not being taken up by trees, it's going to sheet off the ground and create enormous amounts of erosion. So with our swale system, the idea is to interrupt that surplus flow, to create something for that where that water can go and sit. And it's not supposed to flow in either direction. It's supposed to sit, just static. So this is on contour. These lines are on contour. They've measured them carefully. They've done a ditch and a bank. Now, when they started building these swales, they did it in the dry season when there wasn't much else farming to do. Mostly the people in the community laughed at them. They said, what are you doing? It's non-productive. You're wasting time and energy. But they didn't, they were undeterred and they carried on. In Zimbabwe, they love song and music, and they created loads of songs and work songs about why they were doing what they were doing. We're digging a swale, catching water, blah, 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 whatever they would have said. And some people came along to laugh at them, but actually ended up joining in and helping. And from what was a little ragtag group, 5, 6 people, became dozens and then hundreds, and then different people from different villages started all collaborating. They wanted to know what was going on. Why are you doing all this crazy stuff? Well, you can now start to realize is they're starting now to prepare the whole landscape to catch and store water, to hold it, to slow that flow, that surface flow. If we can get the water into the ground and it can't erode, then we can soak it into the soil. And water needs time to soak into the soil. It takes, it takes some hours or days. It doesn't happen immediately because the soil starts to fill up. So not only have we created a swale, so it says there, swales on contour do not flow. They first stop and then infiltrate overland flow. Swales on hillsides are part of access or production systems. So you've got a level line on a level line across the landscape. It becomes a path. It's something you can now walk on. You've got an element that performs multiple functions. Ooh, permaculture. So we're going to stabilize, we're going to reinforce the function by stabilizing it with trees. We're going to stabilize it with shrubs. We might even look at some of the wild plants that are out there in the world and realize that some of them have massive root systems. Some grasses even have roots that go 20 feet down into the ground. Massive, huge root systems. What if we could use some of those to stabilize these lines? Because those root systems are also going to prevent water from flowing off the system, from sheeting off the surface. And obviously they're going to reduce erosion. This is really, really important stuff. So they created guilds of plants which they could combine together to stabilize their swales. So first we built the ditch and the bank, and then we come along and we put some of these specialist deep-rooted grasses. We talked about these fast-growing nitrogen-fixing shrubs. Let's have some of those. Let's plant some of those in the system as well, because they're going to help build the fertility and give us a diversity of species. And some of those fast-growing nitrogen-fixing shrubs have multiple functions. They build soil, but you can chop the leaves and feed them to your goats. You can collect the seeds and feed them to your chickens. You can send all of those nutrients through your animals, and from that get compost, get manure, which you can compost. So they're about strategies to hold on to nutrients. Well, a grass that they decided to go with and to use is called vetiver. Vetiver, it comes from the Himalayas, but it's used around the world. It has many, many useful functions. So if we talk about a plant with multiple uses, hard to beat vetiver. It gives you a lot of biomass, the grass part. You can use it for thatching and roofing. You can weave it into nice, little bags and purses. You could compress it into briquettes for cooking. You could feed it to livestock. You could use it for mulch, soil conditioning. You're getting lots of biomass. So basically you can do whatever you want with the biomass. The roots stabilize soil, reduce erosion, increase groundwater retention. They pull lots of nitrates and phosphates out of polluted environments, and they're tolerant to a very wide range of soils. Vetiver is very drought resistant and fire resistant, because even if the whole upper part of the plant dies off, it's got this huge resource of energy beneath it, so it can just grow back. If it gets burnt off, it will grow back. It doesn't die. It doesn't die easily. And obviously with these deep roots, it's putting carbon down into the soil. It has a very high value use as well, though, is that from the roots you can extract vetiver essential oil. And a vetiver essential oil is in as a component of 70% of all perfumes have that in it, or it's a very, very important element in perfume making anyway. So you can get high value outputs out of it as well. So imagine you start planting your vetiver along the top of your swale. You've now got something that's performing on multiple functions. So let's now jump in. Let's meet one of the farmers in Chikukwa, Mr. Mashlanga, let's say that. And here he is. If we were to interview him, let's say now this is 8 years into the project, something like that. Things are starting to get established. And we were to speak to Mr. Mashlanga and you to ask him about what he was doing, he would have told you, I'm a permaculture farmer. In fact, 80% of the farmers in the Chikukwa Valley, 10 years into the project, would have identified themselves as permaculture farmers. It's a very, very effective penetration into the community. So here's a simple swale. And in fact, what this is here is a vetiver hedge. And a vetiver hedge acts as a single element. So we just planted the what we call slips, the baby plants. Plant them about, 4 inches apart. And as they grow, so you grow this plant, you can dig it up and you can break it into lots of little plants and then spread them out, and then each one will grow into a clump again. Interestingly, it doesn't set seed. It's not fertile. So it's non-invasive. You can only propagate it by literally digging it up and moving it. So it's a non-invasive plant, but it's very easy to propagate too. So you can create a lot of material, you know, in a few short years. So this vetiver hedge acts as a physical barrier to the flow of water, literally stops it, and acting again as a kind of a living swale. And you can see he's got little fields now, but his fields are totally on contour and contained by living edges, so it's stable. So behind him, here's his nitrogen fixing shrubs, again on contour, on a line. They're maybe non-productive for him, but they're building soil. He can constantly pick them, and even though they're thorny, you can crush it with, you know, with a stone or mill it or something. Becomes good food for the goats. They produce a lot of seed, go for the chickens, collects all of that manure. So instead of allowing the animals just to range out around all of the mountains, they peg them out, or they bring them home and they put them in a corral so they can harvest the manure too. These guys are now making compost when they never made compost before. They now understand the value of that. And they diversified their crops. They've moved away from just growing maize and having cattle. They're now growing avocado, citrus, guavas, avocados do really well there, papaya. On the little farm that I lived on in this district, we had so many avocados. There was no point in taking them to market because there were loads of women there sat there with like big pyramids of avocados that they were selling every day. I didn't want to compete against them. I used to feed them to my cows. I had so many. There's such a productive plant. The cows would eat the whole avocado, chew up the stone and everything. The milk you get was just fantastic. So this is a polyculture. He's moving away from monoculture. He's got lots of different kinds of crops. He's got tree crops. He's got fodder and pasture, and he's also growing maize and vegetables and cabbages and things like that. Some things they have little plots that they do alone, and others that they work collectively or communally on. As this scheme unfolded, they slowly won the support of all of the tribal elders, who then started to give them more permission and more support to spread the scheme far and wide. So this has now become the biggest permaculture project in the world is Chukukwa. I think there's now 45,000 families involved in this. It's to think spread out over a huge district. I'm going to show you the next slide, and the next slide is what it looks like now. So, you know, let's just go back. Let's just remember, this is it, 1992. You're going to see the next picture is, I think, 12 years into the scheme, something like that. 2004, 2006, whatever, it doesn't matter. Here we go. Same place, same valley. Now look, on these steeper slopes, forest. When it rains, the forest holds that water, evaporates a lot of it back into the air, rehumidifies the air, it comes back down as condensation. All of that water is now held above the community. That's going to constantly feed the streams, and the issues of water that are coming out are going to be now much more stable and long term, because we've got this vegetation locking up and holding all that water high in the landscape. Now look, we can even open up and create a bit of bare soil. We can do a bit of ploughing and growing of crops, because we've stabilized everything with our contour plantings. Look, contour plantings everywhere, straight lines across the landscape. And we've removed then the possibility of that erosion and the loss of the soils. We've created a sort of a strategy that has many elements to it, but it all supports the function of reducing erosion. And it supports the function of accumulating soil. What's really, really interesting and heartening is, as this project has developed, there's now a really nice documentary video of it. I used to have it on my website. I got told off for copyright infringement, and I took it down. So sorry I can't share that with you, but it is wonderful. And the people who exited the brain drain, the people who went to Harare, went to Joburg, have started to come back. And people are coming back to this area because it's almost like being a peasant farmer. If you come from a subsistence farming background, all you want to do is leave it behind, because it feels like you're just getting trapped in the world of your grandparents or something. When you make it smart, you make it groundbreaking, you make it innovative, then suddenly the younger people are much more interested. There's now people coming from other districts of Zimbabwe coming to Chikukwa to learn permaculture. They're setting up training centers. And in fact, they're people skills. I'm showing you kind of land management things because they're very visible. But really, when you go into the story more deeply, you realize the real skill that they had, that they are developing and have developed, is their ability to build consensus, to resolve conflicts, and to create mutuality and mutual understanding. Imagine that you've got a system where the farmers up here are losing their soil. There's going to be someone at the bottom of the hill who's receiving it. You know, for every loss that you make up the top of the hill, I'm gaining it at the bottom. So you realize that there's winners and losers. So it's not as if it's a straight, obvious thing to do. It's a lot of negotiation, consensus building, and so forth that's required to get you to that point. So it's a great story. Fambidzanai is the training center in Harare. I think Seluct is the acronym they use for the project itself. And yeah, we'll find some more links about that. But what a wonderful story. And there's the story behind, say, one of the world's biggest and most successful permaculture projects. And it's a product of adversity. It's something that's come out of a very difficult situation at a very difficult time. But that, if you like, lack of options forced people to realize, no, we have to make this work. We can't just move on to another land and trash another bit of virgin land. We've actually got to stay and make this work. So permaculture as a tool for building consensus. Permaculture as a way to get a large group of people to see something big and complicated, but to understand it in a way in which they can actually act on it. Yeah, so there you go. There's that, and that's again, I'm thinking about observations of natural systems. To think about, I feel like they've created a succession of plants, a succession of things that have allowed the landscape to develop. They've used multifunctional plants to create the accelerating the abundance of the landscape. Nitrogen fixing edible plants, plants that are barriers, plants that reduce erosion, that then create the conditions. I feel like some of these are non-productive things. They're not, you know, they're not really part of the farm yield, but they create the conditions then that farmers like Mr. Mashlanga can bring his other, you know, diversity of, now he can build his orchard because you've created the conditions for it. I think it's really interesting to think about that. Think about how they work with edges, how they work with diversity, how they work with microclimate, how they're working with this idea of catching and storing energy, slowing down the passage of resources as they travel through a landscape. We've used elements that perform multiple functions, and we've supported the function of soil building and the function of water retention. We've supported that function with multiple elements. So in fact, we're seeing all of those kind of principles of natural systems being applied here to rebuild a system that was almost on the point of collapse, to then turn it back into something that's diverse and abundant, but it's now performing many of the functions that a natural landscape would do as well. And obviously, there's loads of niches within there for biodiversity and birds and things and stuff to be there. So there we go. There's that bit, and I'm going to pause. I think I've done a lot of talking. Love to have some feedback, any thoughts or anything you'd like to share with us. We've got a few minutes before lunch, just a few minutes. But very happy to hear any thoughts or points of clarification or just your own observations.
I think it's great the way they've regenerated this land, you know, in that 20 years. And I think you could apply this anywhere. Because the picture you first showed, I looked at it and I thought, there's no trees. This is just the first thing I noticed. And a lot of land in Portugal looks a bit like that. You know, the way they farm it, and they have quite a lot of fires. So there's a lack of trees, and I'm quite interested in going to Portugal and starting some projects over there. You know, so I find it all very, very interesting because they have a lot of mountains and hills, and there's a lot of water that comes at certain times. They have really hot summers, really dry summers. So I think, you know, I've learned a lot from this and how to change to it.
I think the example in Zimbabwe is really, really interesting, and it's like showing us on a really small scale what we need to do on a global scale. And it's really interesting how they've achieved that, and how it's encouraged people back to the area and being able to sustain all of those people. And we need to do that globally.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I thought that was great just to see that on such a large scale. I'm going to kind of move away a little bit from that though, and just wondered, is like, are there, you know, in like farming schools in the UK or the Western world, is permaculture taught at all as like a subsection of that, or is it something that is just treated as something completely separate? Just curious, really.
It really needs to be, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Increasingly now we're talking about agroecology and stuff like that. People use those terms. It seems that in the mainstream corridors of power, permaculture is a little bit frowned on because it's how it's perceived. One end is because it tries to sort of deal with everything. It's so holistic. I think that's actually its strength. I think that's very important, but because it deals with like social and economic factors as well as just the biology, that somehow it goes a step beyond. And I think again, it's slightly erroneously permaculture's come from an edge. It's come from a societal kind of edge. Who are the early adapters to new ideas? It's always those sort of pioneering type people, and permaculture really took off in the West with, let's just say, more alternative, more hippie-ish, sort of more marginal type people. And it's really rapidly is moving into the mainstream. It's being embraced by more and more and more. But I think a little bit it has a sort of legacy of its direction of not where it came from, but who were the first the early adapters to permaculture. And again, in the early days of permaculture, was a lot of people just sort of offering it as a panacea without really understanding it very deeply. But it is a panacea. It does have so much to offer. So I think sometimes the P word itself is slightly problematic, but everywhere I look, I am finding these ideas are now permeating into everything. Okay. So within the Welsh Assembly, within their farming strategies, within the Severn River management people, they're all starting to use these terms that we are using here. So I think, permaculture is rapidly gaining strength and momentum. It's just sometimes, it's like, it doesn't matter about the name is useful and it's a good sort of peg to hang things on, but if that isn't working for people, what really matters is the component ideas within it. But I think there also is permaculture's, and again, I've talked a lot about Bill and David, like it has founders, it's still, but actually now you can learn and fully study permaculture without ever hearing of Bill Mollison or David Holmgren. It's not like they created it. It's obviously a very, very great communicators and help identify sets of ideas that were used in traditional cultures that are apparent from nature. And they collected that together and presented it in a good, useful way. But it's not about them. And it's not about, we're beyond our sort of founder syndrome, if you like, and all of that. So, yeah, I'd say it's growing fast.
Good. Well, that's good to know, isn't it? Yeah, it gives you heart then. My other question, this will be my last question, completely different again. I mentioned yesterday that like I have a courtyard garden, essentially. There's no like access to the soil underneath. So I grow everything in pots. well, I don't really know what to do because, yeah, at the moment it's still like I just grow things in the summer and then you have nothing until the springtime from autumn onwards. So I just wanted to know, what's the best way of storing soil in pots for the next season? Is there kind of like an easy way of doing it that means that you get the most out of it year on year? I don't obviously I want to recondition that soil. So it's kind of back to basics really, but just wondered if there was some like advice you could give me on that.
Yeah, good question. If the soil's in a pot above ground,
Yeah,
and you get a very cold frost, it's going to freeze solid.
okay.
In a way in which only the surface would do when it's the ground, if you like. The frost can penetrate. It's harder for it to penetrate in deeply. There's one consideration. Another one is obviously keep it covered. So even if it's a flower pot, mulch it. Keep the surface of that soil covered, and then realize that as that mulch is breaking down, nutrients are being made available to the microbes in the soil. So it's keeping alive. There's more activity in it, you know. Yeah, I don't know. 30 centimeters of soil is enough to grow just about everything.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to go much deeper than that. So I might show you some photos of a roof garden project in Reading where we've created a forest garden on a roof. There's only 30 centimeters of soil on the roof. That's 12 inches. So it's only that much. And we've got trees, we've got bushes, we've got shrubs, we've got climbers, we've got everything on there. So there's still a possibility for enormous productivity, even in your pots and even.
Well, that's what I've got percolating in my brain as I'm watching all of this. Really, is that how can I utilize that to its best and make sure I'm not wasting anything? Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, welcome, and thanks everyone for your thoughts. And it's 1 o'clock, so we'll call it a morning, and I'll see you at 7 p.m. Okay. Bye. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye. Bye. Bye.